Aristotelian philosophy, especially the metaphysics, and he's also written extensively on Plato, and even on Xenophon. So I'm, very happy that he's also turning his attention to contemporary affairs. And please, Ed.
So this talk really begins in 1996 at the American Philosophical Association. There was a special session on Israel and the Palestinians. And the lead speaker in the session was Sari Nusseibeh, former Al-Quds University president, member of the Palestinian National Assembly. And the paper he gave was actually about a topic in Thucydides. It's the Melian dialogue. Athens gave the far weaker island of Melos a chance to make a decision about how they wanted to proceed. And Nusseibeh's point was that there really were no good possibilities for the Melians. And that under the circumstances, the only thing that they really could have done or should have done is to just cease negotiations at all. Now, his point was that the Palestinians were in much the same position with Israel. They had no good negotiating options, and they should simply cease negotiations. And since he had been recently involved himself in negotiations, it was a sort of strong and disturbing point. I try to engage him in a number of ways in the question period after he, true to his message, would have nothing to do with me or answering any of my questions. So that started off my thinking, but really what struck me in that session was not so much Nusseibeh, but the audience. So there are lots of controversies that come up at American Philosophical Association meetings. Substantialism, functionalism, extended mind. There are lots of things that people have strong opinions about, but I never saw anything like this. This was an audience that was extremely angry. And the anger was directed toward Israel and toward Jews. So I went in the spirit of many of you who are here, I think, I went to learn. And what I learned was not from anything from Nusseibeh. What I learned was really about, really from the audience. It had always seemed to me that Israel was morally right. I certainly thought that there was not much question that there were Jews had been living in the land for 3,000 years, and that the Jews had a right to return to their own land. But this was really not the opinion of the audience. And what struck me was the real moral outrage at Israel. There were in no, unlike other APA sessions, there was no possibility of discussion. It just seemed obvious that Israel was in the wrong. And that provoked a moral outrage and anger against Israel. It's this anger that interests me here, this anger against Jews. Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. The Nazis always thought they were fighting a defensive war against Jews. And we forget this today because the idea proved so ludicrous. The German army was able to conquer defenseless Jewish communities easily and slaughter their inhabitants, some 6 million of them. They had nowhere to flee. Few of the neighbors were willing to fight the Germans on their behalf. Indeed, many were happy to aid the Germans. The vaunted Jewish wealth and power that the Germans felt it so necessary to crush existed, sadly, only in their twisted minds. We also forget today that National Socialism was not only a political party, but also an ideology. They had a platform with detailed social and economic policies, and no less a figure than Martin Heidegger, joined the party, at least in part because of its ideology. So he was elected the rector of the University of Freiburg in 1933 and shortly thereafter joined the party and pledged to support Hitler. His time in the party and his support of its ideals remain matters of controversy. Some of what the Nazis espoused resonates deeply with Heidegger's own ideas about the preeminence of Germany. And I think there's good reason to think that he was really committed to the party's ideology. On the other hand, it's hard for me to think that he was a really anti-Semitic. His teacher, Edmund Husserl, was Jewish. At least two of his mistresses and many of his most prominent students were Jewish. I think that he was more of an ideologue than an anti-Semite. Of course, the Nazis made no secret of their anti-Semitism. But in 1933, when Heidegger joined the party, it was, I think, possible to think that the party's ideology could somehow be separated from its anti-Semitism. For us, in the distance of time, it seems quite clear that his ideology, its ideology simply was anti-Semitism. And putting the economy in the hands of Germans, exalting the spirit of the German nation, National Socialism, were all reactions to what Henry Ford had called the international Jew. And he came to Heidegger, Heidegger came to realize the true nature of the Nazis, he was, I think, caught between admitting that he had been an anti-Semite, or what may have well been worse for a philosopher of his stature, indeed a political philosopher of his stature, admitting that he'd been duped by a political movement. Although he repudiated the party, he never repudiated its ideology. The problem with the Nazis is, in his view, was that they really were not Nazis. The horror of the Holocaust kept anti-Semitism at bay for half a century after World War II. But as Gabriel just mentioned, now it's back with an intensity that's fed by ideologies. They go by various names, but they all converge on anti-Semitism. Justifying Germany's treatment of Jews, Hitler had pointed to America's treatment of blacks. I don't think that it was accidental that the civil rights movement in the United States took off after World War II. Americans had seen the ultimate consequences of extreme racism, and they were revolted. The promise of American democracy needed to be extended to all, and Jews were on the front lines of the 1960s civil rights marches. For various reasons, relations between blacks and Jews soured in subsequent decades, but Jews remained a reliable voice for civil rights, anti-poverty legislation, progressive politics. It was, therefore, a shock to Jews to find themselves not only excluded by current self-styled progressives, but villainized. After the 2018 Women's March, three of the principal organizers met with Louis Farrakhan and not only refused to condemn his anti-Semitism, but forced out a prominent Jewish activist from the leadership of the Women's March and excluded Jewish groups from participation. Today, Congressman Rashida Tlaib never tires of declaring that no one who supports Israel can be a progressive. A number of Jewish progressives have indeed thrown in their hats with these self-styled these self-styled progressives. A number of Jewish progressives have identified themselves as progressives in this new mode. But the sharp rise in anti-Semitism after October 7th is concerning. In particular, the tolerance for violence against Jews at elite universities that Jews had prided themselves on attending and supporting has shocked many. Consequently, Jews and others are reevaluating their commitments to progressivism in its current form. Is progressive anti-Semitism an unfortunate but superficial mistake, or is it more deeply rooted? Could it be as inseparable from the current progressive ideologies as Nazi anti-Semitism was from Nazi ideology? So that's really my question here. In what is the connection between ideology, progressive progressive ideologies, and anti-Semitism. And I have to say that it, I raised the question, I started thinking about the question, thinking that it would not be anything really significant. But as I thought about it more and more, it became clear to me that the two uh, they really are inseparable from each other, and that's a surprising conclusion. I don't know that I'll convince you of that, but I'd like to set out my case here. So the ideologies that now limit progressivism are relatively recent. They're espoused by academics, they're taught at universities, they stand behind current efforts at diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and they've influenced many who loudly and sometimes violently proclaim their principled opposition to Israel. So let me say at the outset that I don't think any of these ideologies really deserves to be called progressive. They are inimical to the goal that has traditionally defined progressivism, a society without discrimination that provides ample opportunities to all to fulfill their human potential. Indeed, for the most part, these ideologies are the new clothes that do little to hide the emperor's nakedness, or rather, their proponents bear anti-Semitism. One prominent progressive ideology is called intersectionality. So what I'm going to do is just go through some prominent ideologies here, starting with intersectionality. So the term was introduced in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw to signify that people who are Black and female, and thus victims of discrimination on both counts, receive even more discrimination than people who are members of only one of these groups. Since that time, the number of discriminated groups has expanded greatly, and the emphasis has shifted away from multiplying the grounds for discrimination towards uniting those of all groups who are victims of discrimination. The assumption is that those who oppress any minority oppress all minorities. The oppressors are, notably, white males. Since Jews are victims of the oldest, most intense, and by far the most deadly discrimination, they should be included among the oppressed. Usually, proponents of intersectionality claim that Jews no longer suffer discrimination in the United States, and what's more, as white and wealthy, Jews are themselves oppressors of minorities, even Jews who are women, disabled, or members of other groups that they recognize as oppressed. This being Jewish excludes one from the oppressed category and puts one in the oppressor category. This response is, I think, disingenuous for at least two reasons. First, Jews are the victims of the most serious hate crimes by far, and hate crimes against Jews have skyrocketed since October 7th. For all the talk about a rise in Islamophobia and hate crimes against Blacks, their numbers are not even close to the pre-October 7th attacks on Jews. In fact, Jews have been relatively successful in taking advantage of the opportunities they found in the United States, but then so have Arabs and other Muslims, all of whom progressives include among the oppressed. So it can't be economic success that's keeping Jews out of this category. Indeed, if economic hardship is requisite for inclusion among this group oppressed, Muslims in the United States could not qualify. So many have studied or are now studying at elite universities, and they were able to come to the United States because their families were wealthy in the countries that they came from. But there's a second, a more important reason for intersectionalities excluding those who have been most oppressed historically from among the group that they recognize as oppressed. Tom Lehrer sang about it years ago in his National Brotherhood song, which is National Brotherhood Week song, which you'll be happy to know, not sing for you. But the refrain is, oh, the Catholics hate the Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants, and the Hindus hate the Muslims, and everybody hates the Jews. So one ethnic or social group tends to hate other ethnic and social groups, even if they're in much the same position in respect of the larger majority. Intersectionality posits that all oppressed minorities are in the same position and that there are therefore affinities among them. The only way that this notion can avoid being dismissed out of hand is by excluding the one group with which the other oppressed minorities would never, ever unite, that is, the Jews. From this perspective, anti-Semitism is not a causal it's not a casual aspect of intersectionality. It's the linchpin of the theory. Of course, plenty of work needs to be done to explain why the other oppressed groups are not uniting against their common enemy. But this work is within the normal realm of theory refinement. Every theory faces some issues that it needs to somehow explain away. But only it's the exclusion of the Jews from among the oppressed makes the future alignment of diverse oppressed peoples even remotely possible. So the anti-Semitism of intersectionality is what makes it possible for oppressed to imagine oppressed groups all uniting against their supposedly common oppressors. So the need to make this exclusion, the exclusion of Jews, marks intersectionality as a prescriptive theory rather than merely a descriptive theory. Intersectionality divides oppressors and oppressed in something of the way that Marxism divides people into bourgeoisie and proletariat. Insofar as it is descriptive, intersectionality has a place to be taught at universities alongside Marxism, imperialism, and countless other theories. One need not be a Marxist to teach Marxism. However, when it comes to intersectionality, the unity of the oppressed goes against all the facts and observations. And to mention just one, recently, a St. Louis Park School District in Minnesota reversed an earlier decision and now allows Muslim children to opt out of gender identity and sexuality curricula that it had incorporated into its elementary schools. So clearly the Muslims and the people promoting gender identity are really at odds on this issue. So one example of how implausible a unification of the so-called oppressed really is. Intersectionality is so implausible as a description that the theory can only identify the affinities among the oppressed and advocate for their common action. Hence, intersectionality is inevitably a prescriptive theory, an exercise in political advocacy. So the pretense that intersectionality is an objective and descriptive theory allows it to claim a place in university curricula, but the evident failure of its descriptive dimension makes it mainly prescriptive and so undermines the claim. Yet the threat of being labeled as someone who sanctions oppression deters those who would remove it. So just going on to a second ideology now, many advocates of intersectionality have adopted the ideas of Edward Said. In his book Orientalism, 1978, Said argued that the Orient is an idea invented by the West to affirm its own identity and superiority over Arab and Muslim civilization, and thereby to justify European and American colonialism. He was following a pattern he set in his first book, a book on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and there he argued that Conrad constructed an image of Black Africans that would justify the Western conquest and continued oppression of Africa. Said was a literary critic. He dealt with the import of literary images, but ignored the subjects being represented and castigated scholars who did study those subjects. In particular, he singled out the noted Jewish scholar of Islamic civilization, Bernard Lewis, and accused him of masking propaganda as scholarship. But as Lewis pointed out, it was rather Said who failed to respond to the substantive claims that scholars were making about their subjects. And Lewis added, Said thereby gave free rein to his own prejudices. Said was a brilliant rhetorician, and he has been enormously influential. He spurred the whole field of post-colonial studies. I can't hear talk of the oppression of black and brown bodies without thinking about him. By focusing exclusively on the role of the West in constructing an image of Africans and Orientals, he bequeathed to us this idea that the victim plays no role in his victimization. It's just a short step from there to the idea that anything that the victim does against oppression is justifiable. And thus the claims that Hamas's October 7th murders of babies and its rapes of women were not just justified, but really Israel's fault. This is an idea that we've heard many times. Said's views are backwards and upside down. Backwards in that neither the heart of darkness nor Orientalism could have caused colonialism because they emerged long after European colonialism, which began around 1500. European colonialism, like Arab colonialism in the 7th century and 7th and 8th centuries, as well as ancient Persian, Greek, and Roman colonialism, needed no such justification. It's upside down because the stereotypical Western representations of Africans and Arabs emerged from direct experience with the populations, experience as colonizers or as business partners. Lewis and other scholars that were who were Said's targets were not constructing this stereotype, but looking to understand objectively the history and the cultures. Orientalism is more an indictment of the West, of Western scholars, of the Middle East, and of Jews in general, and Bernard Lewis in particular, than an objective contribution to knowledge. But was it really colonialism that excited Said's ire? How much colonialism was there when Orientalism was published in 1978? Imperialism had peaked in the 19th century. By the early 60s, there were virtually no colonies left. There was only one nation to which his anti-colonialist stance could conceivably be applied: Israel. As I said, Said focused on a literary trope and its supposed harm, and he excused the response of its victims. Since there are virtually no other colonial states besides Israel, colonialism's sole current victims are Arabs. It follows that Arab attacks against Israel are predictable, intrinsically innocent, and an anti-colonial theory that applies only against Israel is not a theory at all, neither a literary theory nor a political theory. It's a cloak for anti-Semitism. So ironically, Said himself was a beneficiary of British colonialism. He attended an elite British school in Jerusalem, another one in Alexandria, before attending Princeton and Harvard. Had Israel not existed, Said might well have been among the aristocratic leaders in the region. So there was a personal element in his animus towards colonialism, and it was limited to Israel's colonialism, so-called colonialism. So these days, moving on to still another theory, anti-colonialism is often coupled with Marxism. And this is the basis of the often repeated charge that Israel is a settler colonial state. The phrase was invented by French Jewish Marxist Maxime Rodinson, and he applied it to Israel in a 1988 book. Whereas most colonial powers aimed only to exploit the resources and labor of lands they conquered, settler colonialism aims to displace the original population and possess the land. There have been many examples of migrating populations, and some of these are candidates for being designated as settler colonial states. Among the best examples are the United States, Canada, Argentina, and Australia. But their success is long established, and the native populations that were displaced have no chance of expelling the settlers. Again, the only state regularly accused of being a settler colonial state is Israel. Can the reason be that it's the only one where the supposedly indigenous population retains hope, fanned by world sentiment of displacing the displacers? Is Israel a settler colonial state? There are many ways in which it doesn't fit the model. First, as I mentioned, Jews have been present for 3,000 years. And even though large Jewish populations have been expelled or migrated to other areas, the Jews who began to return to the area in the 19th century saw themselves as reclaiming their historic homeland. Despite the claims of some that the Arab population is indigenous, many Arabs in the area proudly trace their roots to Arabia's 7th century conquest. More recently, many Arabs who now call themselves Palestinians came to Israel from Syria and Egypt only after the influx of Jews brought more economic opportunities to the region. Muslim Arabs rely on the Islamic doctrine that land conquered for Islam can never be relinquished to defend their claim to the area. Though in recent years, recognizing Western values, Arab leaders have claimed to be seeking national rights. In short, neither side sees itself in the terms that would allow Israel to fall under the Marxist analysis. To impose it on populations that see the conflict very differently is an example of what's sometimes called Western explaining, Westplaining. In any case, it is patronizing. The second way that Israel doesn't fit this second settler colonial model is that Jews didn't come to Israel as agents of a mother country. They didn't come to extend European culture, they came to escape it. Third, they didn't come at the behest of another country. There's no country to which they could return. Fourth, Israel didn't conquer the land with force. Initially, they bought the land they occupied parcel by parcel. Many of its owners were absentee Ottoman landlords. Many of the Arabs who later called themselves Palestinians came to Israel from elsewhere for the sake of job opportunities. And they were not, for the most part, landowners. When the UN granted Israel sovereignty in 1948, the state acquired unclaimed land within its borders. Those borders changed when Israel was forced to defend itself, but also when Israel entered a peace treaty with Egypt. In short, when Israel has used force, it's done so from the necessity of defending its sovereignty, not in order to gain land. A fifth reason the settler colonial model doesn't apply. There was, in fact, a population, it was a de facto population swap between Jews living in Muslim countries and Arabs in Israel. Once the Jewish state was established in 1948, many Jews in the Middle East could no longer safely remain in the places they had lived. Around the same time, many Arabs left Israel. A small number were expelled because they occupied strategic areas, but most left because Arab leaders encouraged them to flee so they could return in triumph after Arab armies had destroyed the Jewish population. There have been population swaps before. There was one between Greece and Turkey in 1923, another one between India and Pakistan in 1947. The Jewish-Arab swap is the only one that continues to fester and the only one that has gotten the label of settler colonialism. For all these reasons, Israel is not a settler colonial state. But even though this phrase does not apply, it serves to keep up Arab hopes that the settlers will one day retreat and to identify their cause as a struggle against imperialism. And that allows them to pretend to be Marxist, despite all evidence that very few Arabs actually endorse socialism. As Rodenson, who really was a Marxist, foresaw, since there's no home country to which Israelis could return, those who wish to end the Israeli settler colonial state aim for a massacre. Okay, whereas those in the West tend to think in terms of Western ideologies, Arabs tend to think in terms of Islam and its political versions, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so forth. As I said a moment ago, it's an Islamic doctrine that once a land has been conquered for Islam, cannot revert to being controlled by non-Muslims. It's also the case that Islam does not allow non-Muslims to have equal rights with Muslims in a state. They can have limited influence and are famously subject to an extra tax. So, from the point of view of Islam, a Jewish state in Israel is simply intolerable. That's a significant reason for the intractability of the conflict. Muslims have an obligation to spread Islam, but for most of the last several centuries, it has seldom been an active concern. The recent, the recent rise of political Islam in its various forms signal the return to the active dissemination of Islam, and particularly Islam in its most fundamentalist and conservative version. It's clearly a reaction to the spread of Western values, democratic aspirations, and the rights for women in Muslim lands. Hamas is the Palestinian version of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood. The key thinker behind its ideology, Saeed Qutb, had a British-style education and worked as a teacher. And he lived in the United States for a couple of years between 1948 and 1950. But he was thoroughly repelled by what he took to be the promiscuity of women, the physicality of blacks, and the freedom and materialism of the culture. He was, in short, against democratic government. Qutb promoted Islam as an alternative to Western values. Hamas is sometimes thought to be a social welfare organization. It has as much claim to be one as the medieval church. Both aided the poor, but not without tight strings and a good deal of repression. It's ironic, if not bizarre, that Western progressives support an organization that deprives Gazans of all human rights. Progressives claim to cherish free speech, free assembly, free press, freedom to elect a government, and so forth. B, promotes the oppression of women. C, murders homosexuals. D, controls their own people's livelihoods by forcibly using aid to build massive fortifications and secure arms. The ideology of Hamas is much closer to Hitler than to anything remotely progressive. Many progressives are highly critical of what America has done, but not many reject Western democratic values. It's their shared anti-Semitism that would seem to unite Hamas and progressives. Okay, the last ideology I want to talk about is critical race theory. And you'll see in a moment why I saved it for the last. CRT, as it's sometimes called. It's unabashedly a political movement, and it's also closely aligned with intersectionality, Marxism, anti-colonialism, the other movements, ideologies that I've mentioned so far. The same people see themselves as working in all of these theoretical frameworks. The chief tenet of CRT is the idea that laws that are ostensibly race neutral actually promote racism. The evidence lies in what's called systemic racism, or also called structural racism. And this is the disproportionate ratio of whites to blacks in certain professions and similar disproportions in wealth, incomes, access to resources, medical outcomes, and so forth. So when race plays, for example, when race plays no role in university admissions, the acceptance of blacks is well below their percentage of the overall population, and therefore evidence of systemic racism. Because systemic racism is statistical, there's no identifiable culprit, or rather, it's the entire system that's at fault. CRT aims to explain why there remains a significant black underclass that has not been lifted up out of poverty despite years of affirmative action, anti-poverty, and social welfare programs. And it aims to provide special advantages to those whom it perceives as victims of the system. Affirmative action is one such special advantage, but now that the Supreme Court has limited its use in university admissions, The DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, have pushed for greater numbers of Black, LGBTQ, etc. students under the banner of inclusivity. The thought is that students of different backgrounds make universities better overall. So, in other words, this is one way of trying to push a certain agenda to make up for this so-called structural racism. One problem with appealing to structural or systemic racism is that there are fields that would show the opposite kind of racism. There's a disproportionately high percentage of Black athletes and musicians. Are whites therefore being kept out of these prestigious and lucrative fields? Or is it that the enormous talents of Blacks have enabled them to overcome barriers? Why has their success been more limited in other areas other than, say, music and athletics? That's a question. The persistence of racism shouldn't be discounted as part of an answer. After all, anti-Semitism persists, has become all too clear to Jews after October 7th. So why not racism persisting? It surely does. However, Jews were able to persevere in overcoming obstacles in ways that Blacks were not. Some reasons for this perseverance seem to lie in solid families and in a culture that values education and achievement. This analogy, or rather disanalogy, seems to me to lie at the heart of CRT. 70 years ago, after separate but equal, schools were declared, 70 years ago, after separate but equal schools were declared unconstitutional, and many years after outlawing discrimination in housing and employment, many Blacks remain impoverished, and there are ever more voices claiming that the causes lie not in racism so much as in absent fathers, drugs, gangs, and so forth. In other words, there are increasing claims that the condition of Blacks is not due to external causes so much as social deficiencies within Black families and communities. It seems to me that CRT exists to quell these claims by providing an alternative analysis. That is, to promote the idea that external factors are indeed the source of Black poverty. For it to make this case, it must undermine the notion that a community's culture and the inner drive of its members can overcome external obstacles. CRT does this by ascribing the Jews' success to their whiteness and unfair privilege. If this analysis is right, anti-Semitism is not an attitude that somehow crept into what is basically a good theory and a righteous political movement. Anti-Semitism is intrinsic to the theory and its goals. Anti-Semitism serves the function of forestalling any real consideration among Black leaders about what internal reforms they might seek for their community. I'll say this again. The idea that CRT is really fighting is that it's possible through internal reforms of the Black community for Blacks to be more successful. And the reason that one would think it's possible is that Jews have been fairly successful despite a long history of anti-Semitism. And it's that analogy between the Jews and the Blacks that CRT really is working to undermine. So if that's the case, then the anti-Semitism of CRT is really intrinsic to the movement. And I'll just mention here that shortly after Barack Obama became president, he urged Black children to work hard in school and get ahead. Obama knew what he was talking about. My own children, who all went to our local, predominantly Black high school, reported to me that Black children who did well in school were socially ostracized by other Black children who accused them of acting white. I was surprised how intense the outcry against Obama was from Black leaders. They claimed that he was blaming the victim rather than the racism that kept children from success. To be sure, slavery destroyed family life in nearly all remnants of the African culture of their home. This has left the Black community with a huge deficit. But there have been plenty of Black artists, writers, musicians, and so forth who've done extraordinary work towards creating an American Black culture. This is not something that can be created outside of the community itself. Indeed, to insist as Black leaders and CRT do, that issues in the Black community stem from racism and other external cause, and therefore to demand external remedies, is to perpetuate the very plantation mentality and its accompanying racism that they decry. To provoke Black people to anger and violence over racism reinforces another stereotype and so works against their aspirations. On the other hand, to lower standards in universities and professions for the sake of higher minority admissions and retentions, including, shockingly, no longer giving grades in medical school, is to provoke the very sort of prejudice that CRT purports to combat, as well as to risk incompetent professionals. The Torah enjoins Jews to pursue justice, and indeed, Jews have traditionally supported liberal and progressive causes. It's therefore very painful to find that those whom Jews had strongly supported, those marching for women's rights, those seeking to end oppression and racism, now view Jews as the problem. As I suggested, some Jews would sooner give up their Jewish identity than their progressive identity. We do not have to look far into history to see that this path is unlikely to help. In fact, the ideologies that now seem to define the struggle for justice are relatively recent developments that have co-opted and twisted longstanding movements that were formerly rooted in principles of equality and human rights. It seems to me that you don't have to endorse any of these ideologies to support human rights. As a child, growing up in the state of Maryland in the late 1950s, I unwittingly attended segregated schools. And I well remember my neighbor's fear as the 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington was being planned and taking place. Those were days when people had no qualms about voicing their racism. I'm old enough to appreciate how much progress we've made. What passes for progressivism these days threatens that progress. Indeed, it's already begun to undermine it. In the days when people did not suppress themselves, it was easier to distinguish the different forms of bigotry, what we could call their phenomenology. The anti-Black racism in my youth was based on various judgments about character and reliability and fear. The sexism of my youth was based on false judgments about women's being guided by emotion and so forth. And as I said at the beginning, as I discovered, anti-Semitism is rooted on a self-righteous anger at perceived immorality. And here I want to go to what will be the last part of this way over long talk. I want to talk about this anger and coming to something that was introduced before, discussions of anger. I want to draw on Aristotle. Aristotle says that anger is a desire to harm that arises from the perception of a slight. The desire to harm certainly seems to characterize anti-Semitism because, as I said already, the number of hate crimes far exceed in quantity and severity the crimes against other minorities. But what's the slight here? How could a supposed immorality be construed as a slight? These are the questions that really get at the heart of anti-Semitism, a phenomenon that, despite being much discussed, remains mysterious. likely there are multiple answers, but I want to confine myself here to one set of answers. The elements of the answers are very well known and familiar, but they haven't really been put together. And that's because um, I think people haven't really drawn on Aristotle's insight into what anger is. So it's well known Jews have been victims of thousands of years of oppression, but they survived and thrived against unconcealed anti-Semitism in the early 20th century in the United States and Europe. Jews that continued on. Jews had an impact on every profession, on a business, and in academia. Despite being targeted by Muslim nations and by most of the Beguine Muslims in the world, Israel has defended itself and created what's really a truly remarkable economy. Indeed, such is Israel's impact on technology that cries for of the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanction, these cries are empty because they would require giving up computers, cell phones, and a host of other medical treatments. All this is obvious, but how could it be a slight? How could it make people angry at Jews? How could people feel intensely offended at the success of another people? And why would success provoke accusations of immorality when it doesn't against Jews, when it doesn't provoke anger against others? This is what makes anti-Semitism so mysterious, even after all that's been written about it. So again, back to Aristotle. He identifies three reasons for slights, three kinds of slights. One is looking down on someone, the second being spiteful, and the third is humiliating aggression. So spite is inflicting a pain on others with no gain to oneself. So I don't think that applies here. But the other two do apply. Anti-Semites believe Jews look down on them, and their evidence would seem to be the pride and joy that Jews take in their success. So I have to admit that Jews want to they're not want to express modesty or eschew honors as undeserved, especially since they're fully aware of the obstacles that they had to overcome in attaining them. This may not be right. It may be right, but it is actually certainly unappealing. But I don't think this cause of anger is really going to be able to account for the intensity of the anti-Semitism. The slight that's most pertinent is what Aristotle calls humiliating aggression. Success is a slight of this sort when it's obtained illegitimately at the expense of others. The perception is that only through underhanded means could Jews have obtained what they did. Jews stole Arab land and oppressed them. Jews took jobs and businesses from others in the United States and in Germany. Jews have seized what rightfully belongs to others. Since only a large group effort, immorally conspiring against law and custom, could have succeeded against all odds, it's always all Jews that are collectively guilty of this aggression. Moreover, that Jews managed to overcome poverty, discrimination, and multiple other obstacles is an infuriating indictment of those who have played by the rules but did not succeed. That's why the anti-Semite not only rages against Jews, but is convinced that he has the moral high ground in doing so. As absurd as it sounds, the success of Jews in overcoming anti-Semitism is a slight against the anti-Semites and against those who could not do as well. And it's proof that Jews have resorted to something underhanded. In this way, the success of Jews provokes the self-righteous anger of anti-Semites, an anger they see as legitimate moral indignation. This is exactly what we saw in the CRT. It's a canonical form of anti-Semitism. So, if this analysis is right, anti-Semitism really is unlike other forms of bigotry. Proponents of the ideologies I have considered here are right to distinguish Jews from other victims of oppression. Other victims have been exploited and subjugated by self-interested oppressors who left them dispirited and downtrodden. Jews were punished for supposed moral transgressions, but often managed to succeed nonetheless. In taking Jews from the category of oppressed and identifying them as oppressors, the ideologies that I've discussed express their moral outrage at Jewish aggression, now seen as the aggression of illegitimately claiming to be victims. Ironically, these ideologies do what anti-Semitism has always done: cloak bigotry in professed moral outrage. We cannot escape the conclusion that the ideologies, however they present themselves, are therefore rooted in anti-Semitism. Indeed, one does not need to look hard to see the self-righteous anger directed against Jews and others at pro-Hamas demonstrations. On this phenomenological criterion, the ideologies that I've spoken about here are anti-Semitic and thus oppressive. I can go a step further. From the phenomenological perspective, ideologies that promote anger against Jews based on falsely perceived immorality just are anti-Semitism. Remember, anger is a desire to harm. When the anger characteristic of anti-Semitism is directed against democratic institutions, we are all at risk of losing those institutions. And we in the United States desperately need to talk about our principles, and I think to rededicate ourselves to the principles of freedom, equality before the law, and justice that were intrinsic to our founding documents, even if they were and still are imperfectly realized. The current ideology's insistence on hearing the stories of the underrepresented, on expanding narrative in general, aims to show how ineffectual those principles are. They undermine those principles, even while their ostensible aim, namely to extend justice for all, presupposes them. These ideologies, with their intrinsic anti-Semitism, have now come to define the so-called progressive movement. They stand against the principle of justice and equality of opportunity, and thereby threaten the democratic institutions that are our best hope for maintaining our freedom. Thank you for your patience and indulgence here.